The hour grows late, and the world outside begins to settle into its own quiet rhythm. The creak of floorboards, the distant sound of wind moving through trees, the soft hum of a house settling into the darkness. These are the sounds that accompany the slow drift toward rest, when the mind is allowed to release its grip on the day and simply observe without expectation. If the weight of the hours has left you restless, there is no need to reach for wakefulness. The voice here moves at its own pace, slow and steady, asking nothing more than that you lie still and let the words pass over you like air moving through an empty room. If the work being done here brings some small measure of ease to your nights, a simple subscription or a like offered quietly and without obligation helps ensure this space remains. But there is no urgency, no demand. Only the continuation of what has already begun. The slow unfolding of words meant to accompany the dark. At Lincoln Cathedral, where the stone rises in layers of arched windows and carved figures, the ground beneath holds stories that were never meant to be told. In the 1960s, workers excavating near the foundation uncovered a skeleton, buried not in the careful alignment of a consecrated grave but pressed into the earth in haste, the body placed face down as if hidden rather than interred. For decades, historians assumed the remains belonged to a monk, a natural conclusion given the location beneath a medieval cathedral. But the bones told a different story when examined through isotope analysis, a process that reads the chemical traces left in teeth and bone by the water and food consumed during life. The man buried beneath the cathedral had grown up not in England but in Scandinavia, his bones bearing the markers of a northern diet and a landscape far from the green hills of Lincolnshire. He had walked, mile after mile, across roads and fields and mountain passes, driven not by trade or conquest but by devotion, a pilgrim seeking something holy at the end of a journey that stretched the limits of the human body. His knees showed the wear of decades spent moving across rough ground, his spine the slow compression of a life carried forward on foot. He had arrived at the cathedral not as a monk but as a stranger, collapsing near the walls he had traveled so far to see, and the clergy who found him chose not to cast his body into unconsecrated ground but to bury him quietly, without ceremony, without marker, a solution that avoided scandal without granting honor. For centuries, his face-down burial was interpreted as punishment, a sign of disgrace or heresy. But the science of bones suggested something quieter, a man who believed too deeply and walked too far, whose end came not from sin but from exhaustion. In a Leicester parking lot, beneath layers of asphalt and the accumulated debris of decades, the remains of a king lay hidden for more than 500 years. Richard III, the last English king to die in battle, had been buried not in a royal crypt or cathedral, but in the grounds of a Franciscan friary that was later demolished, built over, and forgotten. When archaeologists in 2012 began excavating the site marked by old records and ground-penetrating radar, they did not expect to find much. Medieval churches were often scavenged for stone after dissolution, their foundations pulled apart and repurposed. But beneath a row of painted parking spaces, they found a skeleton with a twisted spine, the curvature matching contemporary descriptions of the king, and a skull bearing the marks of violent death, wounds consistent with battle injuries sustained at Bosworth Field. DNA testing confirmed the identification through a living descendant, a furniture maker in Canada who shared a maternal lineage with the king. The discovery closed a centuries-old mystery, but it also raised questions about how a king could be lost so completely, his grave paved over, his memory reduced to the caricature painted by Shakespeare and his political enemies. The bones told a story of a man who died in violence, his body stripped and carried from the battlefield, buried in haste by those who had once been his subjects. The parking lot became a monument, the grave excavated and reinterred in Leicester Cathedral, the king finally given the honor denied him at his death. But the image of royal remains lying beneath a car park lingered, a reminder that history does not always preserve its dead with dignity. The Voynich manuscript, named for the bookseller who discovered it in 1912, remains one of the most examined and least understood documents in existence. Its pages, written on vellum and illustrated with drawings of plants that do not exist in nature, contain a script that resembles no known language. For more than a century, cryptographers, linguists, and amateur codebreakers attempted to decipher its meaning, proposing theories that ranged from a lost language to an elaborate hoax. The illustrations added to the mystery, images of naked women bathing in green liquid, astronomical diagrams marked with symbols that seem to follow no recognizable system, and botanical drawings of flowers and roots that could not be matched to any known species. Recent advances in artificial intelligence and linguistic analysis have begun to unlock portions of the text, revealing a language that appears to be a form of proto-Romance, an early offshoot of Latin that was never standardized into writing. The decoded phrases describe herbal remedies, treatments for female ailments, and advice related to astrology and the cycles of the moon. What once seemed like a medieval cipher hiding secrets of alchemy or hidden knowledge now appears to be something simpler, a compendium of folk medicine and health guidance written in a dying dialect by someone with access to plants that may have been imported or imagined. The mystery has not fully dissolved. The identity of the author remains unknown, and many pages resist translation. But the manuscript no longer appears as a puzzle meant to conceal, only as a record of a world where healing and magic overlapped, where the boundaries between observation and imagination blurred into illustrations that looked real but grew from no soil. In the 12th century, in the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, two children emerged from a ditch near the sheep pits that gave the village its name. They were small, their skin tinged with green, and they spoke a language no one in the village could identify. The chroniclers who recorded the event described the children as disoriented and refusing all food except raw beans, which they ate ravenously. Over time, as they began to accept ordinary food, their green color faded, and they learned English. The boy, weaker from the start, died within months. The girl survived and explained that they came from a land where the sun never shone, a place of perpetual twilight, and that they had been following their father's cattle when they heard the sound of bells and found themselves in Woolpit. For centuries, the story was treated as folklore, a medieval fairy tale about fairy children or lost souls. But modern historians have offered a different interpretation. The green tint may have been a symptom of severe malnutrition, a condition known as chlorosis or green sickness, caused by a diet deficient in proper nutrients. The children's origin, described as a land without sun, could have been a reference to the underground chambers of medieval refugee camps, or the tunnels used by displaced populations fleeing conflict. The Flemish immigrants who settled in Suffolk during that period faced persecution and poverty, and their children, lost and starving, may have been taken in by villagers who could not understand their language and interpreted their appearance through the lens of the supernatural. The story, stripped of its magical elements, becomes a tale of displacement, survival, and the strange ways that ordinary suffering is remembered. Across England, in the ancient churches that the countryside, medieval graffiti covers the stone walls in patterns that were long misunderstood. Victorian historians, viewing these markings through the lens of their own fascination with the occult, interpreted them as protective symbols, wards against demons and witches carved into the fabric of sacred spaces to trap evil spirits or confuse them with geometric patterns. Interlocking circles, daisy wheels, and runic symbols were catalogued as evidence of a medieval population living in constant fear of supernatural forces. But modern surveys, using laser scanning and systematic documentation, have revealed a more ordinary truth. The majority of the marks are signatures, names carved by parishioners who wanted to leave a record of their presence. Ships and swords appear frequently, scratched into the stone by men who may have prayed before journeys or battles. Cats, drawn with simple lines, suggest the presence of humor or affection rather than fear. Some marks were devotional, prayers carved into the wall as a physical act of faith. Others were simply expressions of boredom, the medieval equivalent of a school desk carved with initials. The daisy wheels, once interpreted as hex symbols, appear in contexts that suggest they were decorative or ritualistic in a way that had nothing to do with demons. The stones do not whisper of terror, only of human presence, the need to leave a mark, to say I was here, to be remembered. Rungholt, a city said to have been swallowed by the North Sea in a single night in 1362, existed for centuries only in legend. The stories described a wealthy port, arrogant and godless, whose inhabitants so offended heaven that a great storm swept the city into the waves as punishment. For generations, historians dismissed Rungholt as myth, a cautionary tale told to coastal communities to teach humility and obedience. But archaeological surveys using LiDAR and sonar have located the remains of the city beneath the mudflats of the Wadden Sea. The outlines of harbor walls, drainage systems, and dikes have been mapped, revealing a settlement far more substantial than legend suggested. Rungholt was real, a thriving center of trade and agriculture built on land reclaimed from the sea, protected by sophisticated water management systems that failed when a massive storm surge overwhelmed them. The city's destruction was not divine punishment but climate vulnerability, a community living at the edge of the ocean in an era of rising sea levels and increasingly violent weather. The legend preserved a truth that Rungholt existed, that it was wealthy, and that it was lost. But the cause was not sin, only geography and bad luck, a reminder that the sea takes what the sea gives, and the line between myth and history is often drawn by water. The cave at Cainton, in Shropshire, drew attention in recent years for its mysterious carvings and candle niches, features that led internet commentators to declare it a hidden Templar sanctuary. The narrow passages and low ceilings, carved into sandstone beneath a farmer's field, suggested secret rituals and forbidden gatherings, the kind of place where outlawed knights might have met in darkness to preserve their order. But geological and historical investigation placed the cave's origin in the 19th century, not the medieval period. The carvings were Victorian, created by landowners with an interest in Gothic revival and romantic mystery, not by Templars fleeing persecution. The cave had been used in the 20th century by fringe spiritualist groups, and modern visitors included pagans, Goths, and photographers drawn by its atmosphere. The Templar connection, it turned out, was wishful thinking, a story projected onto stone by people who wanted to believe in hidden history. The cave held mystery, but not the kind that involved warrior monks or lost relics. It held the mystery of human imagination, the need to find meaning in old places, to see in shadows and carvings a connection to something larger than the ordinary. The princes in the tower, Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, disappeared from the Tower of London in 1483, and their fate became one of the most enduring mysteries in English history. Accusations pointed to Richard III, their uncle, who assumed the throne after their confinement, or to Henry VII, who defeated Richard and married the prince's sister, consolidating his claim to the crown. In 1674, workers renovating the tower discovered a wooden box beneath a staircase containing two small skeletons, bones that were assumed to be the missing princes and were reinterred in Westminster Abbey. But no scientific analysis was conducted at the time, and the bones have never been tested. In recent decades, pressure from historians and geneticists has renewed calls for DNA testing, comparing the remains to living descendants of the York family line. The technology exists to determine whether the bones belong to the princes or to some other children whose remains were deposited in the same location. The permissions required, involving the Crown and the Church of England, have delayed any examination, leaving the mystery unresolved but no longer beyond reach. The bones rest in their abbey tomb, waiting for a decision that may never come. While the question of what happened to the princes remains open, a murder investigation older than the United States itself. In Strasbourg in 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea began to dance in the street. She danced for days without rest, without music, without apparent cause, until she collapsed from exhaustion. Within a week, dozens of others joined her, dancing uncontrollably in the streets and squares of the city. Within a month, the number had grown to hundreds, and some of them danced until they died, suffering heart attacks, strokes, or simply falling from exhaustion and never rising. The authorities, unable to explain the phenomenon, resorted to the only solution they could imagine. They built a stage, hired musicians, and encouraged the dancers to continue, believing that if the affliction was a form of madness, perhaps music and structure would help them dance it out. The dancing plague of 1518 has been explained in modern terms as a combination of mass psychogenic illness and ergot poisoning, the first a form of collective hysteria triggered by extreme stress, the second a fungal infection of rye grain that produces LSD-like hallucinations. The people of Strasbourg were living through famine and disease, their bodies malnourished, their minds strained by uncertainty. The dancing may have been a release, a way for a community under pressure to express what could not be spoken. Or it may have been a chemical reaction, bread baked from contaminated grain sending hundreds into trance states that their neighbors interpreted through the lens of religion and superstition. Either way, the dancers moved until they dropped, and the city watched, unable to stop what it had started. The leper king, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, ruled a kingdom under constant threat while his body deteriorated from a disease that medieval medicine could neither explain nor treat. Diagnosed in childhood, he was expected to die quickly, but he lived into his 20s, leading armies against Saladin and governing with a mind that remained sharp even as his limbs failed. Historians have long debated the exact nature of his illness, whether it was leprosy in its most severe form or a milder strain that allowed him to function longer than expected. Recent studies suggest he may have had tuberculoid leprosy, a version that affects nerves and skin but does not produce the dramatic disfigurement associated with the disease, or possibly a neurological condition unrelated to leprosy entirely. Contemporary accounts describe him as able to ride and fight in his early years, gradually losing the use of his hands and feet as nerve damage progressed, but never losing the ability to think clearly and command. He died at 24, having outlasted predictions and ruled with enough competence to keep his kingdom intact during his lifetime. The mystery of his illness, like so many medieval medical mysteries, may never be fully resolved. The bones, if they could be tested, might reveal the truth, but his grave, like many royal tombs, is not easily disturbed. What remains is the image of a young king, wrapped in bandages, unable to hold a sword, riding into battle on a horse led by others because he could no longer control the reins himself. In a convent cemetery somewhere in medieval Europe, archaeologists excavating a grave expected to find the remains of a nun buried in the usual way, wrapped in a religious habit, perhaps accompanied by a rosary or a simple wooden cross. Instead, they found two skeletons, the nun and, nestled against her ribs, the bones of a newborn infant. The discovery raised questions that could not be answered by excavation alone. Had the child been stillborn, buried secretly with its mother? Had the nun died in childbirth, her condition hidden from the community until it was too late? DNA testing confirmed what the position of the bones suggested: the infant was biologically hers. The nun had broken her vow of chastity, and the convent had buried the evidence in a grave that preserved both mother and child together. What remained unknown was the circumstances, whether the pregnancy resulted from assault, a consensual relationship, or something in between. The bones showed no signs of violence beyond the trauma of childbirth itself, leaving the question open. The convent's decision to bury the infant with the mother, rather than separating them or denying the nun a Christian burial, suggested either compassion or a desire to keep the secret contained. The grave held its story for centuries, until science opened it again and revealed what the nuns had tried to hide. A skull found in a medieval grave, elongated and misshapen, drew attention for its strange proportions, leading to speculation about aliens, mutants, or ancient genetic anomalies. The shape was too extreme to be natural, too deliberate to be accidental. Forensic analysis revealed the truth. The skull had been intentionally deformed in infancy through a process of cranial binding, a practice found in many cultures across history. The child's head had been wrapped in cloth or bound between boards, gradually reshaping the skull as it grew. The intention was not to create a monster but to create beauty, to mold the head into a shape that signaled status, belonging, or cultural identity. The practice was known among the Huns and other nomadic groups who migrated through Europe during the early medieval period, and the woman whose skull was found had likely been part of such a group. She was not an alien, not a mutant, only a person whose community valued a certain shape of head, a shape achieved through discomfort and patience, a shape that marked her as one of them even in death. In England, a young girl skipping stones across a lake heard her rock strike something solid beneath the surface. She waded out to investigate and found a sword, its blade crusted with rust, its shape unmistakably medieval. Archaeologists called to the site confirmed the sword's age, dating it to between the 9th and 11th centuries, a weapon from the Anglo-Saxon or Viking period. The question of how it came to rest at the bottom of a lake opened several possibilities. It might have been deposited as a ritual offering, a practice common in pre-Christian and early medieval Europe, where weapons and valuables were thrown into water as gifts to gods or spirits. It might have been lost accidentally, dropped from a boat or fallen from a belt during a crossing. Or it might have been hidden deliberately, thrown into the lake to keep it from falling into enemy hands, a medieval version of ditching evidence. The sword, now conserved and displayed, holds its secret. The water that preserved it for 1,000 years does not tell why it was there, only that it was. The Whispering Knights, a group of standing stones in Oxfordshire, lean toward one another as if sharing secrets. They are part of the Rollright Stones complex, a Neolithic monument dating to 3500 BCE, long before knights existed to whisper. But folklore named them for a legend. A king and his knights turned to stone by a witch as they marched toward battle. The name stuck, and for centuries, locals believed the stones moved at night or whispered to each other when no one was listening. Acoustic testing in recent decades revealed that the stones do create unusual sound effects, their arrangement causing whispers to bounce and carry in ways that feel unnatural. The phenomenon has a scientific explanation, but it also explains the folklore. People standing near the stones heard their own voices return to them from unexpected directions and interpreted the effect as the stone speaking. The knights, if they whisper at all, whisper only what the living bring to them. In a monastery in Eastern Europe, a nun buried in winter was found months later to be completely intact, her body showing no signs of decomposition. The monks interpreted this as a miracle, a sign of holiness, and began to treat her as a saint, lighting candles and praying at her grave. When modern researchers examined the remains, they found a different explanation. The body had been buried in cold weather, in a stone crypt with lime-rich soil, conditions that slowed decomposition and promoted natural mummification. The dryness of the air and the absence of bacteria in the soil had preserved her tissues, turning her into an accidental relic. The miracle was real in the sense that her body remained whole, but it was a miracle of geology and climate, not of divine intervention. The monks who venerated her had no way of knowing the difference, and their faith was not diminished by the explanation. The body, now studied and documented, rests again in the crypt, no longer a saint, only a woman who died in winter and was buried in the right place at the right time. The detective branch of Scotland Yard, founded in 1842, consisted of 8 plainclothes officers who were regarded with suspicion by the public they were meant to protect. They worked without uniforms, mingling in taverns and disguising themselves to infiltrate gangs, methods that seemed underhanded to Victorians accustomed to visible authority. Newspapers called them spies, and respectable citizens worried that men who looked like criminals might become criminals. But as London grew into a metropolis of millions, ordinary constables could not keep pace with the complexity of crime. The jewel thefts, fraud schemes, and murders that required more than a nightstick and a lantern to solve. The detectives proved their worth through cases that baffled regular police, tracking master thieves and uncovering conspiracies. Their methods a blend of instinct and slowly emerging science. By the 1860s, they had begun to appear in courtrooms with evidence that carried weight, their testimony shaping the public's understanding of what detection could achieve. They became indispensable, though never entirely trusted, men who moved through the city's shadows because that was where the answers lay. In the early Victorian period, murder investigations relied on guesswork. A coroner might examine a body quickly, listen to witnesses, and declare a cause of death that satisfied the jury. But as the century progressed, doctors began to see the corpse differently, not as a shell to be buried, but as a source of evidence. They cut open stomachs to search for poison, studied bruises to determine whether injuries were inflicted before or after death, and analyzed blood patterns to reconstruct violence. Toxicology emerged as a discipline, and arsenic, the poison of choice for those seeking to inherit quietly, became detectable through chemical testing. The Marsh test, developed in 1836, allowed prosecutors to present scientific proof of poisoning, transforming trials that had once relied on rumor. The public followed these developments with fascination, newspapers reporting on chemical reactions and expert testimony as though describing a new form of theater. The body, once silent, began to speak, and what it said could hang a murderer. Fingerprinting arrived in the late 19th century as a solution to the problem of identity. Suspects could change their names, grow beards, and vanish into crowds, but they could not change the ridges on their fingers. Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, studied fingerprints systematically, categorizing the loops, whorls, and arches that made each print unique. His work demonstrated that the odds of 2 people sharing the same print were astronomically low, establishing fingerprinting as a reliable marker of individuality. Edward Henry developed a classification system that allowed prints to be stored and retrieved, a system adopted by Scotland Yard in the early 20th century. In 1902, a burglar named Harry Jackson was convicted based on a fingerprint left on a freshly painted windowsill, the first major use of the technique in Britain. The case marked a shift. Identity no longer depended on memory or description, but on a mark that could not be erased. Photography and record-keeping transformed policing in the Victorian era. Mugshots, introduced in the 1860s, captured criminals in stark front and profile images, faces that could be stored and compared across years and jurisdictions. Alphonse Bertillon developed a system of anthropometry, measuring skulls, ears, and limbs to create a unique physical profile for each offender. Though later replaced by fingerprinting, Bertillon's system represented the first attempt to turn the human body into data to classify criminals as specimens in a scientific catalog. Criminal records, maintained on index cards and registers, allowed detectives to trace histories across cities, building patterns of behavior that made policing proactive rather than reactive. For the first time, crime could be studied scientifically, criminals categorized, and justice pursued through evidence rather than luck. The crime scene itself became a subject of study in the Victorian period. Before the 19th century, investigations often began with chaos, crowds trampling through alleys, neighbors handling weapons, policemen disturbing evidence without recognizing its significance. The Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 though unsolved, demonstrated the growing importance of preserving the environment of a crime. Detectives cataloged wounds, sketched scenes, and compared patterns, trying to read the story written in blood and placement. Photography captured the exact position of bodies and objects, allowing investigators to revisit scenes long after they were cleared. Fibers, hair, and soil samples began to be collected, not yet analyzed but recognized as potentially significant. The principle that every crime leaves traces took hold, and the crime scene evolved from chaos to evidence. The cultural figure of the detective emerged from this period, shaped by fiction as much as reality. Charles Dickens accompanied Scotland Yard officers on patrols, incorporating their methods into novels that prepared readers for the idea of deduction as an art. Wilkie Collins created Sergeant Cuff in The Moonstone, a detective whose methodical observation anticipated Sherlock Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle's Holmes, debuting in 1887, combined science and intuition, using magnifying glasses and chemical tests to solve mysteries that baffled ordinary police. The public embraced Holmes as a hero of reason, a figure who embodied the Victorian belief that intellect could conquer mystery. Detectives in reality, though less glamorous, benefited from the cultural fascination. Their work elevated in public perception even as they remained objects of suspicion. Criminal profiling emerged in the late Victorian period as a mix of anthropology, psychology, and social prejudice. Cesare Lombroso, an Italian criminologist, argued that criminals were evolutionary throwbacks, recognizable by physical features such as sloping foreheads and large jaws. His theories spread to Britain, where they were debated in universities and applied in police circles. The Ripper murders encouraged speculation about the killer's psychology, doctors providing sketches of a solitary, resentful man prone to violence. Though crude and often prejudiced, these early profiles represented an attempt to understand criminal behavior in psychological terms, to look beyond what a suspect had done and ask what kind of person he was. The Victorians, in their obsession with classification, laid the groundwork for a field that would later become a cornerstone of detective work. By the dawn of the 20th century, policing had been transformed. The Victorians began with constables carrying rattles and lanterns, relying on eyewitnesses and confessions. They ended with detectives using fingerprints, chemical analysis, crime scene photography, and a growing body of forensic science. The change was not just technical. It altered the idea of justice itself, shifting the basis of conviction from luck to evidence, from rumor to procedure. Scotland Yard stood at the center of this transformation, its methods adopted by police forces from Paris to New York. The legacy extended into literature and culture, detectives becoming symbols of rationality, figures who embodied the hope that science could conquer mystery. The Victorian experiments, successes and failures alike, created the foundations of modern policing, ensuring that evidence would speak louder than rumor. For a young man hoping to join the Knights Templar, the journey began not with swords but with silence. The initiation was held at night, in a chapel lit by candles that cast long shadows across stone walls. The candidate was led away from his companions and questioned privately by senior knights, asked whether he was free from debt, whether he was married or bound to a lord, whether he understood that the vows he was about to take would bind him for life. The questions were not formalities. They were safeguards, meant to ensure that no man entered the order with divided loyalties. If found worthy, he was asked again if he wished to proceed, given multiple chances to withdraw before the moment when withdrawal became impossible. The chapel grew quiet, the brothers bowed their heads, and the initiate knelt before the altar to take his oath. The vows themselves were three: poverty, chastity, and obedience, but each carried weight beyond the words. Poverty meant renouncing all worldly possessions, turning over any wealth to the order, owning nothing, not even the sword he would carry into battle. Chastity meant cutting himself off from family life, never marrying, never pursuing women, dedicating his body and spirit solely to God. Obedience meant submitting completely to his superiors, marching when ordered, fighting when commanded, dying if required, without hesitation. The vows stripped him of his past and bound him to a new identity, one that would endure until death or until the order itself dissolved. As he spoke the words, the brothers surrounded him in silence, witnesses to a transformation that left no room for turning back. The clothing of the initiate marked the change outwardly. His worldly garments were removed, and he was dressed in the white mantle of the order, a symbol of purity and a reminder of the chastity he had sworn. In time of war, the mantle would bear a red cross, the sign of martyrdom and sacrifice, a pledge that he was ready to shed his blood for Christ. The sword, blessed in ritual, was placed in his hands, a weapon that belonged not to him but to the order, to be used only in defense of the innocent and punishment of the wicked. The ritual included gestures of humility, lying prostrate before the altar, kissing the ground or the cross, acknowledging his dependence on divine mercy. When the mantle finally rested on his shoulders, he was no longer merely a man but a soldier of Christ, bound by vows and marked by symbols. In the darkness of the chapel, prayers were whispered, words passed from elder to novice in tones so low they seemed to come from the stones themselves. The prayers were rooted in Christian liturgy, invoking the Virgin Mary and the saints, but they followed formulas known only within the order. To outsiders, this secrecy bred suspicion, rumors that the knights denied Christ or worshipped idols during their hidden rites. Within the order, the whispered prayers were the cement that bound each knight to his brothers, a reminder that he was part of something larger than himself, a brotherhood that prayed together, fought together, and died together. The initiate was urged to see himself not as a man of flesh and pride but as a vessel for divine will. His vows framed as following the example of Christ, his obedience compared to Christ's submission to God. Trials of obedience sometimes followed the vows, small tests meant to engrave the idea that a Templar must obey instantly, without hesitation. The initiate might be commanded to kneel for a prolonged time, to remain silent while others mocked him, or to accept an act of humiliation. Such exercises reminded him that pride had no place in the brotherhood, that if he could not surrender his will in a simple act, he could not be trusted in the chaos of war. He was asked a final time whether he truly wished to stay, warned of hardships, battles without end, a life without possessions, the constant risk of martyrdom. If he hesitated, he was encouraged to withdraw. The order preferred a small band of unwavering men over a host of wavering half-brothers. After the vows and trials, the mood shifted. The brothers shared a ritual meal, bread and beans and watered wine eaten in silence while scripture was read aloud. The table was long and simple, no silver, no marks of personal wealth, a deliberate sign that all possessions were shared and no man stood above another. For the new knight, sitting among men who had fought in Jerusalem and Antioch, the meal carried a weight beyond the food. He was no longer an outsider but part of the company, breaking bread with brothers who had sworn the same oaths and endured the same sacrifices. The feast was austere, monastic, and symbolic, a reminder that from this day onward, every action from prayer to battle to eating was done in the company of his brothers and under the gaze of God. Among all the vows, secrecy carried a particular weight. The words and rites the initiate had witnessed must never be repeated outside the walls of the order. To reveal them was to betray not only his brothers but God. The vow was sealed with gestures, a hand on the Gospels, kneeling before the cross, touching sacred relics. The penalty for betrayal was never spelled out, but the implication was clear: excommunication, dishonor, and eternal damnation. The Templars believed secrecy was a matter of survival, protecting their operations, their wealth, their strategies from kings and enemies. But the same secrecy that bound the order together fed suspicion among outsiders. Rumors that the knights worshipped idols or engaged in obscene rituals. The oaths meant to protect became weapons in the hands of their accusers. The initiation ended with blessings, the presiding master laying hands on the initiate's head and invoking divine protection and strength. The prayers drew from the language of the church but were tailored to the martial vocation of the order. The knight prayed over as both monk and soldier, a defender of pilgrims, a scourge of infidels. Psalms were sung, chants of victory and steadfastness echoing like hymns at midnight vigils. The initiate was reminded that his life was no longer his own, a campaign under the command of the heavenly king. Should he fall in battle, his death would not be in vain but counted as a martyr's victory. The promise made the risks of the battlefield not merely tolerable but holy. The final act of initiation was the embrace. The senior knight stepped forward and welcomed the initiate with the kiss of peace, a gesture drawn from monastic tradition, given on the cheek or shoulder as a sign of equality and reconciliation. One by one, the other knights followed suit, offering the same embrace. For the new member, this was a powerful signal. He was no longer alone, no longer a stranger kneeling in shadows. He shared the same destiny as every man in that chapel, bound together in prayer and battle, eating at the same table, riding under the same banner, sharing hardships and glories alike. The order demanded much, but it gave in return the unbreakable fellowship of men who lived and died together. His name was recorded in the rolls of the house, a written sign that his life was now woven into the history of the temple. He had become part of something larger than himself, an international brotherhood stretching from castles in Europe to fortresses in the Holy Land. The embrace carried a weight beyond the moment. To betray the order would mean betraying not only vows and symbols but the faces of the men who had welcomed him. To fight bravely was to honor them. To falter was to let them down. The embrace was not just welcome but a lifelong reminder that loyalty was owed not only to God but to the brotherhood of the temple. When the Knights Templar first emerged in the early 12th century, they were not builders by design. Their mission was simple: to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. But swords alone could not secure the highways of faith, and safe havens became essential. Thus began the transformation of the Templars from warrior monks into architects of some of the most formidable castles the medieval world had ever seen. Unlike the castles of kings or feudal lords, Templar strongholds did not serve dynasties or families. They were communal structures, owned by the order and consecrated to Christ. Each fortress represented not personal glory but a collective mission: to defend the Christian world against enemies and provide sanctuary for travelers. Their castles became both military hubs and spiritual symbols, stone sermons rising out of the landscape. Templar fortifications were strategically placed, anchoring trade routes, guarding mountain passes, and dominating coastal harbors. Many were erected along the frontiers of Crusader states where the clash between Christian and Muslim forces was constant. In Europe, their castles safeguarded treasure houses, training grounds, and commanderies that fueled the Order's global network. Wherever a Templar fortress stood, it announced stability and power, often in lands plagued by conflict. Architecturally, these castles combined brute strength with subtle symbolism. Their walls were thick, their towers carefully angled to repel siege engines, their gates designed to funnel invaders into deadly traps. Yet within those walls lay chapels where knights gathered to pray before battle. The contrast was deliberate: stone bastions of war sheltering quiet sanctuaries of faith. Cracked chevaliers, rising above the Syrian plains, embodied the Templar vision of strength and faith more completely than any other fortress. Perched on a hill nearly 650 meters above sea level, it dominated the surrounding landscape, its silhouette visible for miles. For pilgrims, it was a beacon of safety. For enemies, a daunting reminder of the Crusaders' determination to stay. Though originally built by local lords and later entrusted to the Knights Hospitaller, its design reflected the principles that guided all Templar construction: double concentric walls, deep moats carved from living rock, and towers positioned for maximum defense. Each wall contained passageways for swift movement, ensuring that soldiers could be deployed wherever the threat was greatest. Inside, vast storage rooms allowed the fortress to withstand sieges lasting years, while a chapel stood at its heart, austere and simple, reminding the knights that their battles were fought under divine sanction. The fortress resisted repeated assaults, withstanding even Saladin's armies, and fell only in 1271 after decades of defiance. In Portugal, the Templars built fortresses that anchored the Christian frontier and helped forge the identity of an emerging nation. Tomar, founded in 1160 by Grandmaster Gualdem Pius, rose on a hill above the Nabeiro River and became the order's headquarters in Portugal. Its round church, inspired by the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, symbolized the Templars' direct link to the sacred sites of the Crusades. Across central Portugal, a chain of fortresses, Almoral on a rocky island in the Tagus River, Monsanto carved into granite cliffs, and Pombal controlling vital roads, secured conquered territory, safeguarded Christian settlers, and provided staging points for further campaigns southward. The architecture blended local tradition with Crusader innovation: thick curtain walls, elevated towers, and narrow gateways exploiting Iberia's rugged terrain. When the Templar Order was suppressed, their Portuguese holdings passed to the Order of Christ, a successor institution that carried on Templar traditions and launched voyages into the Atlantic. In England, Templar castles served a different purpose: consolidating wealth, training recruits, and safeguarding resources that sustained the crusading effort abroad. The Temple in London, established in the mid-12th century, was a fortified enclave in the heart of the city, its round church modeled after the Holy Sepulchre. Here knights trained, prayed, and managed the financial dealings of the order, the London Temple becoming a hub of international banking where monarchs deposited treasure and pilgrims secured safe passage. Beyond London, castles at Temple Brewer in Lincolnshire, Templehurst in Yorkshire, and Rothley in Leicestershire served as centers of administration and recruitment, each including a chapel, cloisters, and barns, combining monastic simplicity with military readiness. The round churches, echoing the shape of Jerusalem's most sacred shrine, created an architectural link between England and the Holy Land, allowing worshippers to step into a small fragment of Jerusalem itself. In France, the Templar heartland, commanderies and fortresses combined the functions of monastery, manor, and fortress. La Couvertoire in southern France became a fortified village where knights and local inhabitants lived side by side, high stone walls, towers, and a formidable gate protecting both. Within the walls stood a chapel, barracks, and storage houses, practical, austere, and utterly Templar. In central France, commanderies at Arville and Pains served as training grounds for recruits, self-contained compounds with chapels, halls, and defensive walls. Their simple quarters and communal dining reflecting the order's disciplined lifestyle. These sites also played a vital financial role, storing donations, managing estates, and funding campaigns in the Holy Land. When King Philip IV turned against the order in 1307, many of these castles became prisons, confiscated and repurposed, their ruins whispering of the days when the Templar network stretched from humble farms to impregnable strongholds. In Spain, the Templars were drawn into the Reconquista, the centuries-long struggle to reclaim Iberia from Muslim rule. Castles here were critical tools of survival on a frontier that shifted constantly between Christian and Muslim control. Ponferrada in Leon, rebuilt and expanded by the Templars in the late 12th century, guarded the pilgrim road to Santiago de Compostela, its towers and curtain walls offering safety to travelers and blocking enemies. Monzon in Aragon, rising from a rocky hill, served as both fortress and training ground, gaining fame as the place where the young King James I of Aragon was raised under Templar guardianship. Peniscola on the Mediterranean coast and Miravet overlooking the Ebro River demonstrated the order's skill in adapting architecture to diverse landscapes. Each fortress tailored to its environment yet carrying the same message, that the Templars were immovable defenders of Christendom. Beyond the towering presence of crack de Chevaliers, the Templars maintained a network of castles across the Holy Land, securing pilgrim routes, defending Christian enclaves, and projecting authority into contested territories. Safed in Galilee, rebuilt in the mid-13th century, commanded sweeping views over valleys and trade routes, its altitude making it nearly unassailable. A fortress in the sky that reminded allies and enemies that the Templars were watching. Carrick in Jordan, though primarily held by other Crusader lords, saw Templar cooperation in its defense, its massive walls and deep dungeons symbolizing the brutal realities of frontier warfare. At Bagras and Tortosa, Templar castles guarded crucial mountain passes and coastal lines, creating a chain of strong points that supported both trade and military movement. These fortresses shared common features: concentric walls, narrow gates, and towers positioned for maximum defense, while chapels within anchored the knight's spiritual life. Templar castles were never merely fortifications of war. They were sermons written in stone, every arch, wall, and chapel infused with spiritual meaning. The round churches modeled on the Holy Sepulchre reminded knights that they were spiritually tied to Christ's tomb, the circle symbolizing unity, eternity, and the divine order they defended with their swords. Crosses carved into walls, gateways, and towers reinforced the message: the fortress belonging not to a lord or king but to Christ. High hilltops symbolized divine watchfulness, as if the castle itself were an earthly counterpart to a heavenly citadel. The interior spaces reflected monastic discipline, chapels simple and devoid of luxury, living quarters austere, refectories designed to embody equality. To outsiders, this symbolism could appear intimidating, even secretive, but to the Templars, the message was clear. Their castles were earthly reflections of a higher divine order. When the Templar order was dissolved in the early 14th century, their castles did not vanish. Stone outlasts human institutions, and the fortresses of the temple continued to stand long after the knights themselves were dragged to trial or burned at the stake. Some were seized by kings hungry for wealth and land. Others were handed over to rival military orders. A few quietly crumbled into ruin. Yet in every case, the legacy of Templar architecture endured. In Portugal, many castles were absorbed by the Order of Christ, Tomar becoming the spiritual and logistical heart of Portuguese expansion, its stones forming the cradle of global exploration. In Spain, fortresses passed to orders such as Calatrava or Montesa, ensuring their continued use in the Reconquista. In England, the round churches and ruins of preceptories stand as quiet reminders that the Templar mission was global, stretching from the deserts of Syria to the heart of London. The ruins still crown hills and coastlines, silent witnesses to an age when the cross and the sword were carved not only into history but into the very stones of the land. The stone walls of Temple Church in London have stood for nearly 900 years, their surface worn by weather and touch, the floor worn by the feet of those who came to pray or to simply stand in the presence of something older than themselves. The church was consecrated in 1185, a round nave modeled on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and for centuries it served as the spiritual heart of the Templar order in England. Knights gathered here before departing for the Crusades, their prayers echoing off stone that had been cut and placed by hands that understood the weight of what they were building. The effigies of knights lie on the floor, carved figures in armor, their swords broken by time, their faces worn smooth by centuries of feet passing over them. They rest in attitudes of prayer, hands pressed together, eyes closed, as if waiting for a judgment that has been postponed indefinitely. The Church survived the dissolution of the order, survived the Reformation, survived the fires of 1666 and the bombs of 1940, each time repaired and reopened, each time returning to its purpose as a place where the living come to stand among the dead. At Tomar in Portugal, the Convent of Christ rises from a hill overlooking the Nebeo River, its round church visible for miles across the surrounding countryside. The Templars began building here in 1160, and after the order's suppression, the Knights of Christ continued the work, adding cloisters and chapels in styles that spanned centuries. The Charola, the original Templar oratory, remains at the center, its walls covered in paintings that date from later periods, its octagonal shape echoing the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. The knights who worshipped here did so in the round, their eyes moving across frescoes of saints and martyrs, their attention drawn upward to the lantern that lets light fall onto the altar. The space is small, intimate despite its age, a room where a dozen men could kneel and pray while outside the walls the business of the order continued. The collection of rents, the training of recruits, the planning of expeditions that would carry Portuguese ships down the coast of Africa and into the unknown Atlantic. The explorers who sailed under the banner of the Order of Christ carried with them the memory of this place, its round walls, its silence, its stone. In the ruins of the commandery at Couders in central France, grass grows between stones that once supported the walls of a chapel. The site is quiet now, visited by few, its history recorded only in local archives and the memories of those whose families have lived in the region for generations. The Templars who trained here slept in dormitories that have long since collapsed, ate in refectories whose tables have rotted away, prayed in a church whose roof fell in centuries ago. But the outline of the buildings remains visible in the ground. Low walls marking where rooms once stood, fragments of tile and pottery turning up after rains. A farmer plowing a nearby field turned up a coin in 1987, a small silver piece bearing the mark of the temple, now displayed in a municipal museum where few visitors stop to examine it. The commandery was never a fortress, never a place of sieges or famous battles, only a working farm where knights managed land, collected produce, and prepared for journeys that might take them to the Holy Land or leave them to die in the fields of France. The ruins offer no drama, only the slow dissolution of what was once ordinary. At Ponferrada in Spain, the castle that the Templars rebuilt in the 12th century still stands above the Sil River, its walls enclosing courtyards where pilgrims once rested before continuing their journey to Santiago de Compostela. The fortress changed hands many times after the Templars were dissolved, passing to local nobles, then to the crown, then to private owners who let portions of it fall into ruin. Restoration work in the 20th century stabilized the remaining structures, revealing the layers of construction that accumulated over centuries: Roman foundations, Templar towers, medieval additions, modern repairs. Visitors walk through gatehouses where knights once stood watch, climb staircases that led to living quarters now empty, stand in courtyards where fires burned and meals were cooked and horses were saddled for journeys that might end in death or glory or simply the return to the same walls after months of absence. The castle does not speak of its past in any language the living can understand, only offers its stones for interpretation, their placement, their wear, their persistence. In the desert of Jordan, the ruins of Carrick rise from a hilltop overlooking the King's Highway, its massive walls still standing after 8 centuries of wind and war. The castle was never a Templar fortress in the exclusive sense, passing between Crusader lords and Muslim rulers, but Templar knights served in its garrisons during periods when the order cooperated with other Crusader forces. The underground galleries run for hundreds of meters beneath the main structure, vaulted chambers where soldiers slept and stored provisions and waited for sieges that sometimes lasted years. The stones bear marks of fire from sieges, blackened patches where attackers succeeded in setting the walls ablaze, and the marks of tools used by defenders to repair damage between assaults. A chapel within the walls, stripped of its altar and decoration, retains the shape of its apse, the curve of stone that once framed the celebration of Mass for men who might die before the week was out. The castle fell to Saladin in 1188, its defenders surrendering after months of siege, and the bones of those who died there lie somewhere beneath the ground that surrounds it, unmarked and unmourned, their names lost to any record that survives. The castle of Sion in Syria, known to crusaders as Soane, stands on a ridge between two deep gorges, its position so defensible that it required no garrison to hold it, only a handful of men to roll stones onto any force attempting to approach. The Templars never held Sion, but its architecture influenced their own. The massive ditch carved from living rock, the towers positioned to cover every approach, the cisterns cut deep enough to supply water for years. A knight who saw Sion would carry its image in his mind, would remember its walls when directing the construction of his own fortresses, would know that stone and determination could make a place nearly impossible to take. The castle survives in better condition than many, its walls still standing to their full height in places, its towers still offering views across a landscape that has changed little since the 12th century. The wind moves through its empty halls, and the sound is the only voice left in a place built for war. In the hills of Galilee, the ruins of Safed Crown, a mountain that was fortified since biblical times, its position commanding the routes between Acre and the Sea of Galilee. The Templars rebuilt the fortress in the mid-13th century, expending enormous sums to create a stronghold that could dominate the region and protect Christian settlements from Muslim raids. The castle fell in 1266 after a siege that reduced its walls to rubble, its defenders killed or enslaved, its stones reused by later builders. Excavations in the 20th century revealed portions of the Templar construction, including a chapel whose floor was paved with mosaics, fragments of colored glass that once formed windows, and the bases of columns that supported a roof now gone. The site is quiet now, visited by pilgrims who come to see the views, and by archaeologists who sift through the debris for clues about the men who built and died here. The wind carries the smell of pine and dust, and the only sounds are the calls of birds and the occasional voices of visitors speaking in languages the knights would not have recognized. The castle of Chastelblanc, now known as Safada, rises from a hill in western Syria, its great tower still standing to a height of 28 meters, a landmark visible across the surrounding countryside. The Templars built here in the 12th century, creating a fortress that controlled the approaches to the coastal plain and provided a base for operations against Muslim forces in the interior. The tower served as both keep and chapel, its ground floor vaulted and dark, its upper floors containing living quarters and storage spaces. A church adjoins the tower, its walls still bearing traces of frescoes, its altar long since removed but its apse still recognizable. The castle changed hands several times after the Crusader period, serving as a local stronghold for various rulers, but its core remains Templar, the stones cut and laid by masons who worked under the direction of the order. Visitors who climb to the top of the tower see the same landscape the knights saw, the same hills, the same roads, the same horizon where enemies might appear at any moment. At the castle of Arima in Lebanon, little remains above ground, only scattered stones and the outline of foundations visible in the grass. The Templars held this fortress for decades, using it to control the coastal road and to provide shelter for pilgrims traveling between Tyre and Tripoli. Excavations have revealed pottery fragments, coins, and the bones of animals eaten by the garrison, but no inscriptions, no documents, no names of the men who served here. They were knights who came from France and England and Spain, who spoke different languages and wore the same mantle, who prayed in the same chapel and died under the same walls. Their bones lie somewhere beneath the stones, mingled with the soil, indistinguishable from the earth that surrounds them. The site attracts few visitors, its history recorded only in specialist journals and the memories of local farmers who have always known that the stones in their fields were once walls. The coastal fortress of Tartus, known to crusaders as Tortosa, still stands in part, its cathedral converted to a museum, its walls incorporated into later buildings, its harbor silted up and useless for ships. The Templars maintained a strong presence here, using the port to receive supplies from Europe and to launch raids along the coast. The Cathedral of Our Lady of Tortosa served as the spiritual center of the Crusader presence, its walls thick enough to withstand bombardment, its altar drawing pilgrims who came to venerate an icon of the Virgin said to have been painted by St. Luke. The building survives, its stones worn by centuries of weather, its interior stripped of decoration, but still retaining the proportions that made it one of the finest churches in the Crusader states. Visitors walk through its nave and imagine the knights who knelt here, their armor stacked in corners, their eyes raised to the vaulted ceiling where paintings of saints have long since faded to nothing. The fortress of Belmont in the hills above Beirut has been excavated by archaeologists who uncovered the remains of a Templar commandery. Not a great castle, but a working farm where knights managed agricultural production and collected rents from local villages. The site includes a chapel, a dormitory, a refectory, and storage buildings, all built of local stone and arranged around a central courtyard. The knights who lived here spent their days not in battle but in administration, overseeing the collection of olive oil and grain, settling disputes among tenants, maintaining the buildings and walls that protected the community. They were soldiers who rarely fought, monks who rarely prayed in community, men whose lives were consumed by the ordinary business of running an estate. The excavations revealed the remains of their meals, their tools, their clothing, the small objects that accumulated in the corners of rooms and were lost in the dirt. None of these objects bore names, none told stories, only the mute evidence of lives lived in a place far from the centers of power and fame. In the forests of eastern Germany, the castle of Wildenbruch was built by the Templars in the 13th century as part of their effort to establish a presence in the region. The castle changed hands after the order's dissolution, passing to the Knights Hospitaller and later to local nobles, but portions of the Templar construction survive in the lower walls and the foundations of the chapel. The site is now a ruin, its stones overgrown with moss, its towers reduced to stumps, its moat filled in and planted with trees. Visitors who find their way to the site see little that would identify it as a Templar fortress, only the remnants of walls and the outline of a building that might have been a church. But the stones themselves carry the marks of the masons who cut them, the same marks found on Templar buildings across Europe, a signature that survives when all else is gone. The commandery at Tempelhof in Berlin gave its name to the neighborhood that grew up around it, though no trace of the original buildings remains above ground. The Templars established a farm here in the 13th century, using the fertile soil to produce grain and vegetables that supported their operations in the region. After the order's suppression, the property passed through various hands, its buildings demolished and replaced, its land subdivided and built over until nothing remained to mark the Templar presence except the name, Tempelhof, which still appears on maps and street signs. The knights who worked these fields are forgotten, their names unrecorded, their bones scattered in unmarked graves, but the name endures, spoken daily by people who have no idea that they are invoking the memory of a brotherhood that vanished 7 centuries ago. In the hills of Tuscany, the castle of Magione was built by the Templars on land donated by a local noble, its position commanding the valley below and the road that connected Florence to Siena. The castle passed to the Knights Hospitaller after the Templars' dissolution and later to the Knights of Malta, who maintained it as an agricultural estate into the 18th century. The building survives as a private residence, its medieval walls incorporated into later construction, its chapel converted to a dining room, its towers reduced and remodeled. The current owners know something of its history but cannot say which stones were laid by Templar masons and which were added later. The castle sits among vineyards and olive groves, its walls the color of honey in the afternoon light, a place where the past is present but silent, offering no explanation of itself. The Templar church at Lyon in France survives as part of a larger religious complex, its round nave still used for worship, its walls still bearing the marks of the order's occupation. The knights who prayed here left no record of their presence beyond the building itself. No inscriptions, no graffiti, no objects that can be identified as theirs. The church was built to their specifications, its proportions reflecting the symbolism they valued, its orientation aligning with the path of the sun on certain feast days. Visitors who attend services here sit in the same space where Templars sat, hear the same prayers in different languages, see the same light falling through windows that have been replaced many times, but still admit the sun at the same angles. The continuity is physical, not spiritual. The stone persisting while the beliefs and practices of those who built it have become the province of historians and tourists. In the village of Hogg in Essex, the Templar barn at Cressing Temple still stands, a timber-framed structure built in the 13th century to store grain and hay from the order's estates. The barn is one of the largest medieval timber buildings in England, its roof supported by massive oak posts, its walls weatherboard against the damp, its floor compacted earth that has been walked on for 8 centuries. The barn was never a fortress, never a site of battle, only a place where the ordinary work of farming was carried out year after year, harvest after harvest, by men who wore the Templar mantle or worked under their direction. The barn survived the dissolution of the order, survived the agricultural changes of later centuries, survived the neglect that claimed so many medieval buildings, and now stands as a monument to the ordinary, the everyday, the work that sustained the knights who fought in distant lands. Visitors walk through its length and imagine the grain that filled it, the carts that unloaded at its doors, the men who slept in its loft, the rats that stole from its stores, all of them gone now, only the building remaining. At the commandery of Libdo in Lorraine, excavation has revealed the complete plan of a Templar farm, its buildings arranged around a courtyard, its chapel separate from the domestic structures, its walls enclosing gardens and orchards that no longer exist. The site was abandoned after the order's dissolution and never rebuilt, its stones reused by local farmers, its outlines slowly disappearing under vegetation. Archaeologists working here uncovered the foundations of the chapel, the dormitory, the refectory, and the kitchen, each room identifiable by the objects found within: pottery in the kitchen, a coin in the dormitory, fragments of a chalice near the altar. The men who lived here were not warriors, or were warriors only in theory, their lives consumed by the management of land and the collection of rents, their swords hanging on walls, their armor stored in chests, their days passing in routines that had nothing to do with glory or martyrdom. The excavation revealed the shape of their lives without revealing the lives themselves, the structures persisting while the inhabitants have become names in documents, entries in ledgers, marks on pages that few will ever read. The chapel at Rothley in Leicestershire survives as part of a hotel, its walls incorporated into later buildings, its round nave converted to a lounge where guests sit and read newspapers. The Templars established a preceptory here in the 13th century, using the site to manage their estates in the Midlands and to provide accommodation for knights traveling between London and the north. After the order's suppression, the property passed through many hands, its buildings altered and extended, its original purpose forgotten by all but historians. The round chapel remains recognizable, its shape giving away its Templar origin, but the interior has been changed beyond recognition, the altar replaced by a fireplace, the pews replaced by sofas, the walls paneled and painted in colors the knights would not have recognized. Guests who stay here may notice the unusual shape of the lounge, may ask about it, may learn something of the building's history, but most simply sit and read, unaware that they occupy a space where men once knelt and prayed before riding to their deaths. At the commandery of Montsons in southern France, the church survives as a parish church, its Templar origins visible in its architecture, its walls bearing the marks of the order's occupation. The knights who worshipped here left graffiti on the walls, names and symbols scratched into the stone, the same impulse that led pilgrims to mark the places they visited. The graffiti includes crosses, shields, and the names of men who cannot now be identified, their families unknown, their fates unrecorded. The church continues to serve its original purpose. Mass celebrated weekly, weddings and funerals held within its walls, the continuity of use linking the present to the past in ways that museums cannot replicate. The Templars who built this church would recognize its purpose, if not its details, would understand that the prayers spoken here still invoke the same God, would know that the building they raised with their labor and their money still stands, still serves, still holds the silence between words. In the hills of Aragon, the castle of Monzon rises above the town that clusters at its base, its walls enclosing courtyards where the young King James I of Aragon was raised under Templar guardianship. The castle passed to the order in the 12th century and served as one of their principal strongholds in the region until the suppression. After the Templars were dissolved, the castle continued in use, its defenses updated, its buildings modified, its purpose shifting with the centuries. The Templar chapel survives, its round nave intact, its altar restored, its walls bare of decoration but still conveying the austerity that the order valued. The knights who trained here learned to ride and fight in the courtyards, learned to pray in the chapel, learned to obey in the halls where their superiors commanded. They came from families across Europe, sent to the order as boys, raised within its walls, their identities shaped by the discipline and the routine that governed every hour of every day. The castle of Miravet in Catalonia perches on a cliff above the Ebro River, its walls following the contours of the rock, its towers rising from the stone as if grown there. The Templars took possession in the 12th century and held it for almost 200 years, using it to control river traffic and to dominate the surrounding countryside. After the suppression, the castle passed to the Knights Hospitaller, who maintained it until the 19th century, when it was abandoned and fell into ruin. Restoration work in the 20th century stabilized the remaining structures, revealing the Templar chapel, the refectory, the dormitories, the cisterns and storehouses that sustained the garrison. The castle is open to visitors now, who climb its stairs and stand on its walls and look out over the river that has not changed its course in 1,000 years. The knights who stood here saw the same water, the same hills, the same sky, their eyes scanning for enemies who never came, their minds occupied with the ordinary thoughts of men waiting for something to happen. At the castle of Peniscola on the Mediterranean coast, the Templars built on a promontory that had been fortified since Roman times, its position almost impossible to assault, its walls rising directly from the sea. The castle commands views along the coast in both directions, its towers visible to ships approaching from any direction. After the Templars, the castle served as the residence of the antipope Benedict XIII, who held court here during the Great Schism, and later as a fortress and prison, its walls accumulating the marks of each successive occupation. The Templar chapel survives, its altar long gone, its walls stripped of decoration, but its form still recognizable, the space where knights prayed before sailing to the Holy Land or returning to their commanderies in the interior. Visitors who stand at the edge of the promontory and look out to sea see what the knights saw: the endless water, the horizon where nothing moves for hours, the isolation of a fortress built on the edge of the world. The commandery at La Rochelle in France served as the Templars' principal port on the Atlantic, the place where ships loaded with men and supplies departed for the Holy Land and returned with goods and pilgrims. No trace of the Templar building survives above ground, the site built over many times, its history preserved only in documents and the occasional archaeological find. Excavation in the 1980s uncovered the foundations of a warehouse, its floor littered with pottery from Syria and Egypt, evidence of the trade that passed through this port. The knights who supervised this trade were businessmen as much as warriors, managing accounts, negotiating prices, arranging shipping, their days consumed by commerce rather than combat. They were no less Templars for that, their vows binding them to the same poverty, chastity, and obedience that bound the knights who fought at Gaza and Acre. But their lives were shaped by ledgers and letters rather than swords and shields. In the city of Paris, the temple served as the Templars' headquarters in France, a fortified compound that included a tower, a church, and extensive buildings for administration and storage. The temple was one of the most powerful institutions in the kingdom, its wealth and influence rivaling that of the crown, its walls protecting the treasury of France and the deposits of nobles and merchants who trusted the Templars with their money. After the suppression, the temple passed to the Knights Hospitaller and later to the crown, its buildings gradually demolished or incorporated into later construction. The tower where the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was imprisoned before his execution survived into the 19th century, when it was demolished by Napoleon. No trace remains above ground, the site now occupied by a square and a fountain, the memory of the temple preserved only in street names and historical markers. The knights who walked these grounds, who prayed in its church, who counted its gold and silver, have left no physical trace, only the record of their presence in documents that survive in archives. Their names read by scholars who try to reconstruct the lives of men who lived 7 centuries ago. At the castle of Chinon in the Loire Valley, the Templars were imprisoned and interrogated in 1308, their cells still visible in the towers where they were held. The castle had been a royal fortress for centuries before the Templars arrived, and it continued as such after their trials, its walls accumulating the marks of later prisoners and later renovations. The graffiti left by the Templar prisoners remains on the walls of the towers, names and symbols scratched into the stone, prayers and pleas carved by men who knew they would never leave. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was held here before being transferred to Paris for execution, and his name appears among the inscriptions, though scholars debate whether the writing is his or the work of later visitors. The castle is open to tourists now, who climb the stairs to the towers and stand in the rooms where men waited to die, their eyes tracing the same scratches in the stone that they made, their voices silent, their bodies dust, their names still legible. The prison at Geysers in Normandy, where Templars were held after their arrest, survives as part of the castle that dominates the town. The dungeon where the knights were confined is still intact, a circular room cut into the rock, its walls damp, its only light entering through a narrow slit high above. The men held here were not the leaders of the order, not the famous names recorded in trial documents, but ordinary knights and sergeants who happened to be in France when the arrests began. They were questioned, tortured, forced to confess, and then left to rot in cells like this one, their fates unrecorded, their bones mingled with the stone. The dungeon is empty now, visited by tourists who peer through the grate and try to imagine what it would be like to be lowered into that darkness and left there. The days passing without change, the only sounds the drip of water and the distant movement of guards who never spoke. At the castle of Laux, also in the Loire, the cell of one Templar prisoner has been preserved, its walls covered with graffiti carved during his captivity. The prisoner, whose name is unknown, carved a calendar into the stone, marking the days as they passed, and carved religious scenes, a crucifixion, a saint, a figure that might be the Virgin. He carved his own face, a crude self-portrait, and carved the faces of his jailers, their expressions hostile, their features exaggerated. The graffiti covers the walls of the cell, layer on layer, the work of months or years, a record of a mind struggling to maintain itself in isolation. The prisoner's fate is unknown. Whether he was released, executed, or died in the cell, his bones removed and buried somewhere, his name erased from records. Only the carvings remain, his testament, his proof that he existed, that he suffered, that he left his mark on the stone. The tower at Coudray in central France, where Templars were imprisoned after the suppression, still stands in a field, its walls cracked, its roof gone, its interior open to the sky. The tower was part of a larger complex that has since disappeared, its stones reused for other buildings, its site plowed and planted. The prisoners held here left no graffiti, no record of their presence, only the tower itself, a structure that survived because it was too massive to be worth demolishing. The tower is empty now, its floors rotted away, its windows empty sockets, its walls covered with ivy. The men who were held here would not recognize it, would not know that it still stands, would not care if they did. They are gone, their names forgotten, their bones scattered, their prayers unheard. Only the stone remains, patient and indifferent, waiting for the next 1,000 years to pass. At the castle of Chinon, in the room where the Templars were interrogated, a fireplace still stands, its mantel carved with figures that may represent the knights who were questioned here. The room is large, vaulted, lit by windows that overlook the river, a space designed for comfort rather than confinement. The cardinals who conducted the interrogation sat at a table, writing down the answers of the prisoners, recording their confessions and denials, their pleas and accusations. The knights who stood before them were old men, many of them broken by torture, frightened by the prospect of death, willing to say whatever would make the questioning stop. They confessed to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to worshipping idols, to acts so grotesque that they could not have been true, but the interrogators wrote them down and used them as evidence. The room preserves none of this, only its proportions, its stone, its silence. The weight of what happened here carried only in documents that survive in archives. Their pages yellowed, their ink faded, their words still legible. In the archives of the Vatican, the records of the Templar trial occupy hundreds of pages, the testimony of knights questioned across France, Italy, England, and Spain. The documents record the words of men under pressure, men who contradicted themselves, who accused each other, who denied everything and then confessed and then denied again. The parchments are stored in boxes, handled only by scholars wearing gloves, their contents transcribed and translated and analyzed for clues about what actually happened. The documents do not agree with each other, do not provide a clear picture, do not answer the questions that historians ask. They only record the confusion, the fear, the desperation of men caught in a political storm that they could not understand and could not escape. The words they spoke, or were forced to speak, survive in the curls of ink on parchment, the only trace of voices that fell silent 700 years ago. The seal of the Templars, showing two knights riding a single horse, symbolized the poverty of the early order, the idea that these warriors shared everything, even their mounts. Impressions of the seal survive on documents preserved in archives across Europe, the wax broken or faded, the image still recognizable. The seal was used to authenticate letters, to close agreements, to mark the order's approval of transactions involving land, money, or men. The knights who applied the seal to these documents were administrators, not warriors, men whose work kept the order functioning while others fought. Their names are recorded in the documents, witnesses to agreements, parties to transactions, their signatures or marks attesting to their presence. The documents survive, and the names survive, but the men themselves have vanished, their bodies decayed, their faces unknown, their lives reduced to the few lines that record their participation in events that mattered only to the people involved. The Rule of the Temple, the document that governed the lives of the knights, survives in several manuscript copies, its Latin text prescribing the behavior expected of those who wore the white mantle. The rule covers every aspect of daily life, from how to eat to how to pray to how to fight, its provisions detailed and specific, its tone severe and paternal. The knights who followed this rule knew its contents by heart, heard it read aloud at meals, discussed it in chapter meetings, measured their conduct against its requirements. The manuscripts that preserve the rule are themselves objects of study, their margins marked by later readers, their pages worn by use, their bindings repaired many times. The words of the rule are the same words the knights heard, the same commands, the same prohibitions, the same promises of salvation for those who obeyed and damnation for those who did not. The inventory of the Templar treasury, compiled after the arrests, lists the objects found in the temple in Paris, gold and silver, jewels and relics, vestments and books. The list includes items of immense value, crowns and crosses, chalices and candlesticks, textiles embroidered with gold thread, manuscripts illuminated with precious pigments. The inventory also includes ordinary objects, pots and pans, tools and furniture, the equipment needed to run a large household. The objects themselves have mostly disappeared, melted down, sold, lost, or destroyed, their existence known only through the descriptions in the inventory. The scribes who compiled the list worked quickly, itemizing what they found, estimating values, preparing records for the officials who would decide what to keep and what to dispose of. Their words survive, the only trace of objects that once filled the rooms of the temple, objects that knights had used and treasured, objects that passed into other hands and vanished from history. The bones of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, were burned on an island in the Seine in 1314. His ashes scattered in the river so that no relics could be venerated. The site of his execution is now part of the Isle de la Cite, built over many times, no trace remaining of the pyre or the crowd that watched him die. He was given a final chance to recant his confession, and instead he proclaimed the innocence of the order and the falsity of the charges, dying as a heretic in the eyes of the Church and a martyr in the eyes of those who believed him. His last words were recorded by chroniclers, who disagree on what he said, their accounts varying in ways that suggest they were shaping the story to fit their own purposes. The truth of what he said is lost, along with his bones, his ashes, his voice, his name now remembered but his body dissolved in the waters that still flow through Paris. In the years after the suppression, the Templars who survived the trials dispersed across Europe, some joining other orders, some returning to lay life, some disappearing into obscurity. In Portugal, they became the Order of Christ, continuing their work under a new name, their identity preserved in the ships that sailed down the African coast and the castles that still stand on hills above rivers. In Spain, they merged with other military orders, their traditions absorbed, their history rewritten. In England, they faded into the landscape, their lands granted to others, their churches converted to parish use, their names forgotten by all but local historians. The knights who had worn the white mantle became farmers and priests and merchants, or died in prisons and on pyres, or vanished into the crowds of cities where no one knew their names. The order that had dominated the Holy Land and financed kings and built castles that still stand was gone, its members scattered, its records sealed, its secrets carried to graves that would never be opened. The last Templar in Germany may have been a man named Hughes, who appears in a document from 1318 as a former knight living on a pension granted by a local noble. The document records the payment of a small sum, enough to live on but not enough to thrive, and notes that Hughes is old and infirm, unable to work, dependent on charity. He had been arrested in 1308, imprisoned, questioned, and eventually released when no evidence could be found against him. He returned to his home region, where his family had once held land, but the land had been confiscated and granted to others, leaving him with nothing. The pension kept him alive for a few more years, until he died and was buried in an unmarked grave, his name recorded only in the document that authorized the payments. He was the last, or one of the last, a man who had once been a knight of the temple, who had taken vows of poverty and chastity and obedience, who had prayed in round churches and ridden under the Red Cross, who had seen his brothers burned and his order destroyed, and who ended his life alone, dependent on the charity of a stranger, his death unnoticed and unremarked. In the cemeteries of Europe, graves that may hold Templar remains are scattered among the millions of other graves, unmarked, unidentified, their occupants unknown. The knights who died natural deaths, who survived the arrests and lived out their lives in obscurity, were buried in parish churchyards or monastic cemeteries, their graves marked with simple stones that have long since been moved or broken or overgrown. The bones that archaeologists occasionally find, buried in the ruins of Templar commanderies, cannot always be identified as belonging to members of the order, the context suggesting but not proving their identity. They were men who lived and died, who prayed and fought, who kept their vows or broke them, who hoped for salvation and faced judgment, and who now lie in soil that has forgotten them, their names erased, their stories untold, their presence marked only by the persistence of stone walls that still stand where they once stood. The round churches remain at Temple Church in London, at Tomar in Portugal, at Leon in France, at Cambridge and Northampton, and a dozen other places where the Templars built. They are used now for worship or tourism or events, their original purpose half remembered, their history reduced to plaques and guidebooks. Visitors walk through them, glance at the effigies, read the inscriptions, and move on, their attention passing to the next site on their itinerary. The churches do not complain, do not demand, do not offer any explanation of themselves beyond what the guides provide. They simply stand, as they have stood for 8 centuries, their stones slowly wearing, their foundations slowly settling, their walls slowly accumulating the marks of time. They were built to last, and they have lasted, outlasting the order that built them, outlasting the kings who destroyed that order, outlasting the centuries that have passed since the last Templar knelt in prayer within their walls. They will last longer still, into futures no one can imagine. Still standing, still silent, still waiting for nothing at all. The commandery at Metz in Lorraine was one of the wealthiest in France, its lands stretching across the fertile valleys of the Moselle, its revenues funding expeditions to the Holy Land and maintaining knights who never saw Jerusalem. The complex included a church, a refectory, dormitories, stables, workshops, and storage buildings arranged around a courtyard that served as the center of daily life. The knights who lived here rose before dawn for prayers, ate their meals in silence while scripture was read aloud, and spent their days managing the agricultural production that sustained the order's operations across Europe. They were not warriors in any active sense, though they trained with weapons and maintained their horses, ready to ride if called. The call rarely came. Their war was fought in ledgers and fields, in negotiations with tenants and disputes with neighboring lords, in the slow accumulation of resources that would be sent east to men who actually fought. After the suppression, the commandery passed to the Knights Hospitaller, who maintained it for centuries, and then to local nobles who gradually dismantled it, reusing its stone for other buildings. Nothing remains above ground now, only the memory recorded in documents and the occasional fragment of carved stone turned up by plows. At the commandery of Brule in central France, excavation has revealed the foundations of a chapel, its apse facing east, its nave narrow and simple, its walls barely rising above the ground. The site was abandoned after the Templar suppression and never rebuilt, its stones carted away for use elsewhere, its location gradually forgotten. Archaeologists working in the 1990s identified the site through old records and spent several seasons uncovering what remained. They found the bases of columns, fragments of painted plaster, pieces of stained glass, and the bones of those buried in the chapel floor, men who had been laid to rest in the place where they had prayed. The bones were removed for study and later reinterred, their identities unknown, their stories lost. The chapel had been small, holding perhaps 30 people at a time, its walls plain, its altar unadorned, a place for men who had renounced the world to worship in simplicity. The excavation revealed the shape of that simplicity without revealing the lives of those who lived it. The Templar house at Duzens in the Languedoc was a working farm, its buildings arranged around a courtyard, its fields stretching to the horizon. The knights who lived here grew grapes and olives, raised sheep and cattle, and collected rents from the peasants who worked the land. They were farmers who wore the white mantle, administrators who prayed at regular hours, men whose days were measured by the needs of livestock and the demands of tenants rather than the movements of armies. The house survived the suppression by passing to the Hospitallers, who continued to farm the land, and then to local families, who gradually modified the buildings until little of the original structure remained. A chapel survives, incorporated into a later house, its round apse still visible in the wall, its stones bearing the marks of Templar masons. The current owners know something of its history but cannot say which parts are original and which were added later. They live with the past as a presence, not a subject of study. In the hills of the Ardèche, the commandery of jails sits in a valley surrounded by chestnut forests, its buildings largely intact, its chapel still used for occasional services. The Templars established themselves here in the 12th century, drawn by the isolation and the agricultural potential, and remained until the suppression. The Hospitallers took over and stayed until the French Revolution, when the property was seized and sold. Private owners have occupied it since, maintaining the buildings, farming the land, living in the shadow of walls built by men who have been dead for 700 years. The chapel contains frescoes from the 14th century, painted after the Templars were gone, their subjects biblical, their colors faded, their presence a reminder that the building has served many purposes and many communities. The current owners open the chapel to visitors occasionally, showing them the frescoes, telling them what they know of the history, answering questions that no one can fully answer. The commandery at Arville in the Loire Valley has been restored and opened to visitors, its buildings interpreted as a museum of Templar life. The chapel, the refectory, the dormitory, the stables, and the gardens have been reconstructed based on archaeological evidence and historical records, offering a vision of how the knights lived. Visitors walk through rooms furnished with reproductions, see displays of weapons and tools, read panels explaining the order's history and daily routines. The site is quiet, set back from roads, surrounded by fields that have been farmed for centuries. The men who lived here would recognize the layout, if not the details, would know where the altar stood and where they slept and where they ate, would understand that this place, though changed, still preserves the shape of their lives. The museum attracts a steady stream of visitors, most of them tourists passing through the region, few of them staying long enough to absorb more than a superficial impression. The site does not mind. It waits, as it has always waited, for the next person to stand in its spaces and wonder. At the commandery of Paynes in Champagne, where the order was founded in the early 12th century, nothing remains above ground. The site is marked by a plaque, placed by a historical society, noting that here stood the house where Hugh de Paynes and his companions first gathered to dedicate themselves to the protection of pilgrims. The land has been built over, plowed under, forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. The plaque is small, easy to miss, its text worn by weather, its presence ignored by most who pass. The founders of the order, the men who created something that would shape the medieval world for 2 centuries, lie in unmarked graves somewhere beneath the soil, their bones indistinguishable from the earth, their names preserved in chronicles but their bodies returned to the ground without marker or monument. The site offers nothing to see, only the knowledge that here, in this ordinary field, something began that would end in fire and ash and scattered bones. The castle of Safeda in Syria, still standing after 8 centuries, was used as a military position as recently as the 20th century. Its walls adapted to modern weapons, its towers fitted with machine gun nests. The strategic value of the site outlasted the Templars, outlasted the Crusades, outlasted the Ottoman Empire and the French Mandate and the Syrian Republic. Men who had never heard of the Templars occupied the same positions, looked out over the same approaches, defended against enemies who came from the same directions. The castle was damaged in fighting during the Syrian Civil War, its walls scarred by shellfire, its towers partially collapsed, its future uncertain. The stones that had stood for 800 years were finally broken by weapons the Templars could not have imagined. Their integrity compromised, their survival no longer certain. The castle waits now, as it has always waited, for whatever comes next, for repair or ruin, for preservation or demolition, for the next chapter in a history that has not yet ended. The castle of Chastel-Pellerin, built by the Templars on the coast south of Haifa, was one of their largest fortresses, its walls extending into the sea, its harbor protected by towers, its garrison numbering in the hundreds. The castle fell in 1291, the last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land, its defenders killed or captured, its walls dismantled, its stones reused by later builders. Nothing remains above ground now, the site identified only through excavation and the descriptions in medieval texts. The sea has reclaimed part of the area, the waves washing over stones that once supported towers, the sand covering foundations that were laid with such care. The knights who died here lie somewhere beneath the earth or water, their bones scattered, their names recorded only in the lists of those who perished in the final days of the Crusader states. The site is quiet now, visited only by archaeologists and the occasional curious traveler, its history written in the fragments that remain. At the castle of Bagras in the Amanus Mountains, the Templars held a pass that controlled access between Syria and Cilicia, their fortress dominating the route that armies and merchants had used for millennia. The castle changed hands many times, passing between Crusaders and Armenians and Mamluks, its walls rebuilt and modified by each successive occupant. The Templars lost it in 1188, regained it, lost it again, and finally abandoned it after the fall of Acre. The castle stands today in ruins, its walls broken, its towers collapsed, its chapels and halls open to the sky. The stones are covered with lichen, the floors overgrown with vegetation, the views still commanding but the purpose gone. The knights who served here knew that their position was vital, that without Bagras the road to Antioch lay open, that their vigilance protected the Christian states to the south. They held as long as they could, and then they left, and the castle passed to others, and now it passes to no one, only the wind and the birds and the occasional visitor who climbs the slope to stand among the ruins. The castle of Rochefort in the Ardennes was never a major fortress, only a small commandery where a handful of knights managed local estates and provided a base for travelers. The site was excavated in the early 2000s, revealing the foundations of a chapel, a hall, and several smaller buildings, all arranged around a courtyard. The knights who lived here left little behind, only the usual debris of daily life, broken pottery, worn-out tools, the bones of animals they had eaten. The excavation produced no dramatic finds, no treasures, no inscriptions, only the ordinary evidence of ordinary lives. The site has been backfilled now, the foundations covered again with earth, the fields returned to pasture. The knights who lived here are as anonymous in death as they were in life, their names unrecorded, their deeds unremarked, their presence marked only by the stones that were uncovered and then covered again. In the village of Templecombe in Somerset, a painting of Christ was discovered in the 1950s, hidden beneath whitewash in a building that had once been part of a Templar preceptory. The painting dates to the 12th or 13th century, its style consistent with the period, its subject matter appropriate for a chapel or chapter house. The building had been used for centuries as a barn and storehouse, its walls covered with layers of whitewash and plaster, the painting completely hidden. When the whitewash was removed during renovations, the image emerged, a bearded Christ with staring eyes, his expression stern, his hands raised in blessing. The painting is now displayed in the local church, a fragment of Templar art that survived by being hidden, by being forgotten, by being covered over and ignored until chance brought it back to light. The knights who worshipped in its presence would recognize it, would know that it had been painted by someone who understood their faith, their devotion, their need for images that reminded them of what they fought for. The painting survives, and the building survives, and the village survives, each carrying the memory of the order in its own way. The chalice found at the commandery of San Bevignate in Perugia is a simple object, a silver cup with no decoration, its surface worn by use, its form practical rather than ornate. The chalice was used for Mass, held in the hands of priests who were also knights, passed from celebrant to celebrant over decades of worship. It was buried with care, wrapped in cloth and placed in a cavity beneath the altar, hidden when the Templars knew that their time was ending. The chalice was discovered during restoration work in the 20th century, still wrapped, still preserved, still bearing the marks of the hands that had last touched it. The men who hid it hoped to return, hoped to retrieve it, hoped to continue the worship that had been interrupted. They never returned, and the chalice waited 7 centuries in the dark, its purpose unchanged, its presence unsuspected, until the restorers lifted the stone and found what had been left behind. The reliquary from the temple in Paris, described in the inventory as containing a piece of the true cross, was among the most precious objects owned by the order. The reliquary was gold, set with gems, its shape that of a cross within a cross, its interior holding a fragment of wood said to be from the cross on which Christ died. The inventory lists it in detail, describing the gems, the inscriptions, the chains by which it was suspended above the altar. The reliquary disappeared after the arrests, its gold melted, its gems sold, its fragment of wood lost or destroyed or preserved somewhere unknown. The true cross had been divided many times, its fragments scattered across Christendom, and the Templars' piece was only one among many. But the reliquary that held it was unique, crafted for the order, used in their ceremonies, seen by knights who knelt before it and prayed for salvation. It is gone now, its gold in other objects, its gems in other settings, its wood in dust or in some other reliquary whose provenance has been forgotten. The sword found in the Thames in the 19th century, now in the British Museum, is a simple weapon, its blade rusted, its hilt missing, its origin uncertain. It may have belonged to a Templar, dropped during a crossing or thrown into the river as an offering or hidden to prevent capture. The sword is displayed in a case with other medieval weapons, its label offering the possibility of a Templar connection without certainty. Visitors pass it without stopping, their attention caught by more elaborate objects, more famous artifacts, more certain histories. The sword does not care. It waits, as it has waited for centuries, its steel slowly corroding, its shape still recognizable, its purpose still clear to anyone who looks closely. It was made to kill, and it may have killed, and it was lost or hidden or discarded, and it was found, and it was preserved, and it now rests in a museum, its story incomplete, its secret still held in the rust that covers its blade. The seal matrix found at the commandery of Duxford in Cambridgeshire is a small object, a piece of bronze engraved with the image of a knight on horseback, his shield bearing the cross of the order. The matrix was used to make impressions in wax, sealing documents that passed between the commandery and other houses, authenticating the orders and agreements that kept the network functioning. The matrix was lost or discarded when the commandery was dissolved, buried in the soil, hidden from those who might have destroyed it. It was found centuries later by a metal detectorist, who recognized its significance and reported it to the local museum. The matrix is now displayed with other medieval seals, its image clear, its inscription legible, its purpose explained in the label beside it. The knights who used it would recognize it, would know that it had sealed their letters, their receipts, their instructions to brothers in distant places. The matrix survives, and the documents it sealed survive in archives, and the connection between them has been reestablished by scholars who study such things. The frescoes at the Templar church in Cressac, France, depict scenes of battle, knights in armor charging against enemies, their lances leveled, their crosses visible on their mantles. The paintings date to the 12th century and are among the few surviving examples of Templar art that show the order's military role. The knights in the frescoes are idealized, their faces calm, their horses graceful, their enemies falling beneath their charge. The paintings were whitewashed during the Reformation and rediscovered in the 19th century. Their colors faded but their compositions intact. The church is no longer used for regular worship, maintained by a historical society that opens it to visitors on request. The frescoes cover the walls of the nave, wrapping the viewer in images of holy war, of men who killed and died in the name of faith. The knights who worshipped here saw these images daily, their eyes moving across them during Mass, their minds connecting the paintings to their own lives, their own battles, their own hopes for salvation. The frescoes survive, and the church survives, and the knights are gone, their bodies dust, their names forgotten, their faces preserved only in these painted figures that may or may not resemble them. The floor tiles at the commandery of Temple Ewell in Kent, uncovered during excavation, bear the marks of the knights who walked on them, their surfaces worn by centuries of feet, their patterns barely visible beneath the wear. The tiles were made locally, their clay dug from nearby pits, their glazes fired in kilns that have long since disappeared. They were laid in patterns that repeated across the floor, crosses and geometric designs that gave order to the space. The excavation revealed the extent of the floor, the arrangement of the rooms, the relationship between chapel and hall and domestic spaces. The tiles were lifted, conserved, and relaid in a museum, their context lost but their survival assured. The knights who walked on them felt them under their feet every day, their surface familiar, their patterns known by heart. The tiles survive, and the memory of the knights survives in the wear that marks them. The slight depressions where feet fell most often, the places where generations of brothers stood and knelt and passed. The manuscript known as the Templar Rule, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, is a small book, its pages vellum, its binding medieval, its text written in a careful hand. The rule was copied many times, distributed to commanderies across Europe, read aloud at meals, consulted in chapter meetings, memorized by knights who needed to know its provisions. This particular copy belonged to a commandery in southern France, its margins marked with notes, its pages worn by use, its binding repaired in the 14th century after the order was gone. The manuscript survived because it passed into other hands, its text still useful, its provisions still relevant to those who followed the rule of Saint Benedict or the customs of other religious houses. It was read and used and preserved while the order that created it faded into history. Now it rests in a library accessible to scholars, its pages digitized, its contents published, its words available to anyone who wants to know what the Templars were required to do, how they were required to live, what they believed, and how they expressed those beliefs in the routines of daily existence. The charter from the commandery at Bisham in Berkshire records the gift of land from a local lord, its text in Latin, its seal attached by a strip of parchment. The charter was drawn up in the presence of witnesses, their names listed at the bottom, their identities recorded for posterity. The land passed to the Templars, who farmed it for generations, using its income to support their operations. The charter survived the suppression because it was kept with other documents, passed to the Hospitallers, and eventually deposited in archives where it remains. The names of the witnesses are preserved, ordinary men who happened to be present when a piece of land changed hands, their names now read by scholars who try to reconstruct the networks of people who supported the order. The charter is a small thing, a single sheet of parchment, but it carries the weight of centuries, the evidence of transactions that shaped the landscape and the lives of those who lived on it. The inventory of the commandery at Montessoissons, compiled after the arrests, lists the contents of the house in meticulous detail, room by room, object by object. The inventory describes the chapel furnishings, the vestments, the chalices, the books, the relics. It lists the contents of the dormitory, the beds and blankets and chests. It itemizes the kitchen equipment, the pots and pans, the knives and spoons. It records the livestock, the horses and cattle and sheep, and the tools used to farm the land. The inventory is a snapshot of a moment, the moment when the Templars were taken and their possessions seized. Their lives interrupted, their future ended. The document survives in a regional archive, its pages intact, its text legible, its details offering a window into the ordinary existence of men who have left no other record. The objects themselves are gone, scattered, reused, destroyed. But the list remains, a catalogue of what was lost, a testimony to the lives that were lived with those objects, day after day, until the day when everything changed. The prison records from the Tower of London include the names of Templars held there in 1308, their identities noted, their fates recorded in brief entries. Some were released, some died in custody, some were transferred to other prisons. The records are brief, administrative, offering no insight into the conditions they endured or the thoughts they had. The names themselves are ordinary, the names of men from England and France, men who had joined the order and served it and now found themselves confined in a royal fortress, accused of crimes they may or may not have committed. The records survive in the National Archives, their pages consulted by historians, their information extracted and analyzed. The men themselves are gone, their bodies buried somewhere, their names preserved only in these administrative notes, their stories untold, their voices silent. The papal bull that dissolved the order, issued by Clement V in 1312, survives in multiple copies, its text disseminated across Europe, its provisions carried out by bishops and kings. The bull recites the charges against the Templars, describes the investigations, announces the suppression, and transfers their property to the Hospitallers. The language is formal, legal, definitive, the language of an institution that knows its power and intends to use it. The bull was read aloud in churches, posted on doors, copied into registers. It marked the end of the order, the conclusion of a process that had taken years and consumed the lives of thousands. The copies that survive are in archives and libraries, their seals broken or missing, their texts still legible, their words still carrying the weight of the decision that ended the Templars. The bull is a document, only a document, but it changed the course of history, and its words still matter to those who study what happened and why. The letter from Edward II of England, ordering the arrest of the Templars in his kingdom, is preserved in the National Archives, its wax seal still attached, its text written in the formal language of royal command. The letter was sent to sheriffs across England, instructing them to seize the Templars and their property on a specific date, to hold them in custody until further notice. The arrests were carried out as ordered, the knights taken from their commanderies, their possessions inventoried, their lands sequestered. The letter is a small piece of parchment, but it set in motion events that ended the order in England, that sent men to prison and trial, that scattered the brothers who had lived and worked in English commanderies for 2 centuries. The letter survives, and the record of its execution survives, and the story of what happened survives in the documents that followed, layer upon layer of paper and parchment, recording the end of something that had once seemed permanent. The Chronicle of the Templar Trial, written by a contemporary observer, survives in a single manuscript, its pages worn, its ink faded, its account partial and biased. The chronicler was not neutral, had his own interests, his own prejudices, his own reasons for recording events in a particular way. He described the arrests, the interrogations, the confessions, the executions, shaping his narrative to suit his purposes. The manuscript was copied and recopied, passed from hand to hand, read by those who wanted to know what had happened and why. It survives now in a library, consulted by scholars who try to separate fact from fiction, to understand what the chronicler saw and what he invented, what he believed and what he wanted others to believe. The chronicle is a source, only one source, but it carries the voices of those who lived through the events, distorted perhaps but still present, still speaking across the centuries. The Confession of Jacques de Molay, extracted under torture and later retracted, survives in multiple versions, the accounts of what he said varying in ways that reflect the different agendas of those who recorded them. In one version, he confessed to all the charges, admitted to spitting on the cross and denying Christ and worshipping an idol. In another, he denied everything, proclaimed his innocence and the innocence of the order. In a third, he confessed under torture and then recanted when the torture stopped, his words shifting with his circumstances. The documents that record his words are contradictory, unreliable, shaped by the pressures of the moment and the purposes of those who wrote them. They survive in archives, studied by scholars who try to reconstruct what actually happened, what he actually said, what he actually believed. The truth, if there is a truth, lies somewhere in the gaps between the documents, in the spaces where the words do not quite match, in the silences that surround the recorded statements. The ashes of the Templars burned in Paris in 1314 were scattered in the Seine, their remains carried downstream, dispersed in the water that flows through the city. The site of the execution is now a square, busy with traffic, surrounded by buildings that have been built and rebuilt many times since that day. No marker commemorates what happened there. No plaque notes the men who died. No monument stands where the pyres burned. The ashes are gone, dissolved, carried to the sea, mingled with the water that Parisians drink and the rain that falls on the city. The men themselves are gone, their names recorded in chronicles, their fates debated by historians, their bodies returned to the elements from which they came. The Seine flows on, indifferent, carrying the memory of what happened in the form of water that was once ash, ash that was once bone, bone that was once a man who wore the white mantle and rode under the red cross. The bones of the Templars who died in prison, who were never tried or executed, but simply left to rot in cells, lie in unmarked graves across Europe, their locations unknown, their identities forgotten. Some were buried in prison yards, their graves dug by fellow prisoners, their bodies lowered into earth that would be built over and forgotten. Others were thrown into pits, their remains mingled with those of common criminals, their names never recorded, their deaths unnoticed. The archaeologists who occasionally find bones in the vicinity of medieval prisons cannot identify them, cannot say whether they belong to Templars or to others who died in the same place. The bones are studied and dated and then reinterred or stored, their secrets unrevealed, their stories untold. The men who wore the white mantle lie somewhere beneath the soil of Europe, their bones slowly dissolving, their presence marked by nothing except the persistence of the earth that holds them. The treasure of the Templars, if there was a treasure, has never been found. The inventories taken after the arrests recorded the possessions of each commandery, the gold and silver, the jewels and relics, the vestments and books. But rumors persisted that the Templars had hidden something, had spirited away their wealth before the arrests, had buried it in caves or forests or beneath the floors of churches. The rumors have never been confirmed, never been disproven, only persisted across centuries, feeding the imaginations of those who want to believe that something remains, that the order left behind a secret, a legacy, a prize waiting to be discovered. The searches continue, amateur and professional, using ground-penetrating radar and old documents and intuition, looking for something that may not exist, may never have existed, may have been only a story told to explain the disappearance of wealth that was simply seized and spent. The treasure, if there is a treasure, waits somewhere, in a cave or a crypt or a hole in the ground, its location known only to the dead, its secret kept for 7 centuries and counting. The ruins of the Templar commandery at Temple Brewer in Lincolnshire stand on a hill above the surrounding farmland. Their walls reduced to fragments, their tower still visible from a distance. The site is managed by English Heritage, open to visitors who climb the hill and walk among the stones. The tower, known as the Temple Tower, was built in the 13th century and served as a landmark for travelers crossing the Lincolnshire wolds. The rest of the commandery has been excavated and then covered again, its foundations marked by low walls that show the outline of the buildings. The knights who lived here farmed the land, collected rents, trained recruits, and prayed in a chapel that has long since disappeared. The wind blows across the hill, carrying the sound of birds and the distant noise of traffic on roads that did not exist when the Templars walked here. The tower stands, its stones weathered, its purpose changed, its presence still commanding attention from those who pause to look. The round church at Cambridge, dedicated to the Holy Sepulchre, was built by the Templars in the early 12th century and remains in use as a parish church. The building has been modified over the centuries, its interior renovated, its windows replaced, its roof rebuilt, but its round nave survives, a reminder of the Templar presence in the city. The church stands on a corner, surrounded by modern buildings, its shape unusual among the spires and towers of Cambridge. Visitors step inside and find themselves in a circular space, the altar at the center, the walls curving around them, the light falling from windows high above. The knights who worshipped here would recognize the form, if not the details, would know that this space was built to echo the church in Jerusalem, to bring the Holy Land to England, to remind them of what they fought for. The church continues to serve its original purpose. Mass celebrated weekly, weddings and funerals held within its walls, the continuity of use linking the present to the past in ways that museums cannot replicate. The Templar Barn at Cressing Temple in Essex is one of the largest medieval timber buildings in England, its roof supported by massive oak posts, its walls weatherboarded against the damp. The barn was built in the 13th century to store grain and hay from the Order's estates, its size reflecting the wealth of the commandery and the productivity of its lands. The barn survived the dissolution of the Order, survived the agricultural changes of later centuries, survived the neglect that claimed so many medieval buildings, and now stands as a monument to the ordinary, the everyday, the work that sustained the knights who fought in distant lands. Visitors walk through its length and imagine the grain that filled it, the carts that unloaded at its doors, the men who slept in its loft, the rats that stole from its stores, all of them gone now, only the building remaining. The barn is a simple structure, a place for storing crops, but it carries the weight of centuries, the evidence of lives lived in service to an order that asked everything of its members and gave them, in return, a place in a brotherhood that stretched across the world. The chapel at Rothley in Leicestershire, now part of a hotel, retains its round shape despite centuries of modification. The Templars established a preceptory here in the 13th century, using the site to manage their estates in the Midlands and to provide accommodation for knights traveling between London and the north. After the Order's suppression, the property passed through many hands, its buildings altered and extended, its original purpose forgotten by all but historians. The round chapel remains recognizable, its shape giving away its Templar origin, but the interior has been changed beyond recognition, the altar replaced by a fireplace, the pews replaced by sofas, the walls paneled and painted in colors the knights would not have recognized. Guests who stay here may notice the unusual shape of the lounge, may ask about it, may learn something of the building's history, but most simply sit and read, unaware that they occupy a space where men once knelt and prayed before riding to their deaths. The chapel does not mind. It has adapted, as it must, to survive, its stones still standing, its purpose changed but its presence unchanged, waiting for whatever comes next. The church at Garway in Herefordshire, originally built by the Templars, retains its Norman tower and the outline of its round nave. though the nave was later replaced by a rectangular structure. The church stands in a small village, surrounded by fields and farms, its stones the same color as the landscape. Inside, a Templar grave slab is set into the floor, its surface worn by centuries of feet, its inscription barely legible, its cross still visible. The slab marks the burial place of a knight whose name has been lost, whose life has been forgotten, whose bones lie somewhere beneath the stone. The church continues to serve the village, its congregation small, its services quiet, its history known only to those who take the trouble to read the guidebook or ask the vicar. The slab remains, its cross worn but persistent, a reminder that someone lies here, someone who wore the white mantle, someone who prayed in this church, someone whose name is no longer spoken but whose presence is still marked by stone. The Templar sites of Europe are scattered across the landscape, some preserved, some ruined, some vanished entirely. They are visited by tourists and scholars and the simply curious, people who come to see what remains, to stand where knights once stood, to touch stones that were laid 8 centuries ago. The sites do not offer answers, do not explain themselves, do not reveal their secrets. They only persist, their stones slowly weathering, their walls slowly crumbling, their presence slowly fading into the landscape that surrounds them. The knights who built them are gone, their bodies dust, their names forgotten, their deeds recorded only in documents that few will ever read. But the stones remain, and the stones are enough. They carry the memory of the order in their mass, their weight, their persistence. They will outlast the tourists, outlast the scholars, outlast the centuries that have already passed and the centuries still to come. They will stand until they fall, and when they fall, their fragments will remain, scattered across fields and forests, waiting to be found by whoever comes after, whoever wonders what stood here, whoever asks the questions that have no answers. The commandery at Metz in Lorraine was one of the wealthiest in France, its lands stretching across the fertile valleys of the Moselle, its revenues funding expeditions to the Holy Land and maintaining knights who never saw Jerusalem. The complex included a church, a refectory, dormitories, stables, workshops, and storage buildings arranged around a courtyard that served as the center of daily life. The knights who lived here rose before dawn for prayers, ate their meals in silence while scripture was read aloud, and spent their days managing the agricultural production that sustained the order's operations across Europe. They were not warriors in any active sense, though they trained with weapons and maintained their horses, ready to ride if called. The call rarely came. Their war was fought in ledgers and fields, in negotiations with tenants and disputes with neighboring lords, in the slow accumulation of resources that would be sent east to men who actually fought. After the suppression, the commandery passed to the Knights Hospitaller, who maintained it for centuries, and then to local nobles who gradually dismantled it, reusing its stone for other buildings. Nothing remains above ground now, only the memory recorded in documents and the occasional fragment of carved stone turned up by plows. At the commandery of Brule in central France, excavation has revealed the foundations of a chapel, its apse facing east, its nave narrow and simple, its walls barely rising above the ground. The site was abandoned after the Templar suppression and never rebuilt, its stones carted away for use elsewhere, its location gradually forgotten. Archaeologists working in the 1990s identified the site through old records and spent several seasons uncovering what remained. They found the bases of columns, fragments of painted plaster, pieces of stained glass, and the bones of those buried in the chapel floor, men who had been laid to rest in the place where they had prayed. The bones were removed for study and later reinterred, their identities unknown, their stories lost. The chapel had been small, holding perhaps 30 people at a time, its walls plain, its altar unadorned, a place for men who had renounced the world to worship in simplicity. The excavation revealed the shape of that simplicity without revealing the lives of those who lived it. The Templar house at Duzens in the Languedoc was a working farm, its buildings arranged around a courtyard, its fields stretching to the horizon. The knights who lived here grew grapes and olives, raised sheep and cattle, and collected rents from the peasants who worked the land. They were farmers who wore the white mantle, administrators who prayed at regular hours, men whose days were measured by the needs of livestock and the demands of tenants rather than the movements of armies. The house survived the suppression by passing to the Hospitallers, who continued to farm the land, and then to local families, who gradually modified the buildings until little of the original structure remained. A chapel survives, incorporated into a later house, its round apse still visible in the wall, its stones bearing the marks of Templar masons. The current owners know something of its history but cannot say which parts are original and which were added later. They live with the past as a presence, not a subject of study. In the hills of the Ardèche, the commandery of jails sits in a valley surrounded by chestnut forests, its buildings largely intact, its chapel still used for occasional services. The Templars established themselves here in the 12th century, drawn by the isolation and the agricultural potential, and remained until the suppression. The Hospitallers took over and stayed until the French Revolution, when the property was seized and sold. Private owners have occupied it since, maintaining the buildings, farming the land, living in the shadow of walls built by men who have been dead for 700 years. The chapel contains frescoes from the 14th century, painted after the Templars were gone, their subjects biblical, their colors faded, their presence a reminder that the building has served many purposes and many communities. The current owners open the chapel to visitors occasionally, showing them the frescoes, telling them what they know of the history, answering questions that no one can fully answer. The commandery at Arville in the Loire Valley has been restored and opened to visitors, its buildings interpreted as a museum of Templar life. The chapel, the refectory, the dormitory, the stables, and the gardens have been reconstructed based on archaeological evidence and historical records, offering a vision of how the knights lived. Visitors walk through rooms furnished with reproductions, see displays of weapons and tools, read panels explaining the order's history and daily routines. The site is quiet, set back from roads, surrounded by fields that have been farmed for centuries. The men who lived here would recognize the layout, if not the details, would know where the altar stood and where they slept and where they ate, would understand that this place, though changed, still preserves the shape of their lives. The museum attracts a steady stream of visitors, most of them tourists passing through the region, few of them staying long enough to absorb more than a superficial impression. The site does not mind. It waits, as it has always waited, for the next person to stand in its spaces and wonder. At the commandery of Paynes in Champagne, where the order was founded in the early 12th century, nothing remains above ground. The site is marked by a plaque, placed by a historical society, noting that here stood the house where Hugh de Paynes and his companions first gathered to dedicate themselves to the protection of pilgrims. The land has been built over, plowed under, forgotten and remembered and forgotten again. The plaque is small, easy to miss, its text worn by weather, its presence ignored by most who pass. The founders of the order, the men who created something that would shape the medieval world for 2 centuries, lie in unmarked graves somewhere beneath the soil, their bones indistinguishable from the earth, their names preserved in chronicles but their bodies returned to the ground without marker or monument. The site offers nothing to see, only the knowledge that here, in this ordinary field, something began that would end in fire and ash and scattered bones. The castle of Safeda in Syria, still standing after 8 centuries, was used as a military position as recently as the 20th century. Its walls adapted to modern weapons, its towers fitted with machine gun nests. The strategic value of the site outlasted the Templars, outlasted the Crusades, outlasted the Ottoman Empire and the French Mandate and the Syrian Republic. Men who had never heard of the Templars occupied the same positions, looked out over the same approaches, defended against enemies who came from the same directions. The castle was damaged in fighting during the Syrian civil war, its walls scarred by shellfire, its towers partially collapsed, its future uncertain. The stones that had stood for 800 years were finally broken by weapons the Templars could not have imagined. Their integrity compromised, their survival no longer certain. The castle waits now, as it has always waited, for whatever comes next, for repair or ruin, for preservation or demolition, for the next chapter in a history that has not yet ended. The castle of Chastel-Pellerin, built by the Templars on the coast south of Haifa, was one of their largest fortresses, its walls extending into the sea, its harbor protected by towers, its garrison numbering in the hundreds. The castle fell in 1291, the last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land, its defenders killed or captured, its walls dismantled, its stones reused by later builders. Nothing remains above ground now, the site identified only through excavation and the descriptions in medieval texts. The sea has reclaimed part of the area, the waves washing over stones that once supported towers, the sand covering foundations that were laid with such care. The knights who died here lie somewhere beneath the earth or water, their bones scattered, their names recorded only in the lists of those who perished in the final days of the Crusader states. The site is quiet now, visited only by archaeologists and the occasional curious traveler, its history written in the fragments that remain. At the castle of Bagras in the Amanus Mountains, the Templars held a pass that controlled access between Syria and Cilicia, their fortress dominating the route that armies and merchants had used for millennia. The castle changed hands many times, passing between Crusaders and Armenians and Mamluks, its walls rebuilt and modified by each successive occupant. The Templars lost it in 1188, regained it, lost it again, and finally abandoned it after the fall of Acre. The castle stands today in ruins, its walls broken, its towers collapsed, its chapels and halls open to the sky. The stones are covered with lichen, the floors overgrown with vegetation, the views still commanding but the purpose gone. The knights who served here knew that their position was vital, that without Bagras the road to Antioch lay open, that their vigilance protected the Christian states to the south. They held as long as they could, and then they left, and the castle passed to others, and now it passes to no one, only the wind and the birds and the occasional visitor who climbs the slope to stand among the ruins. The castle of Rochefort in the Ardennes was never a major fortress, only a small commandery where a handful of knights managed local estates and provided a base for travelers. The site was excavated in the early 2000s, revealing the foundations of a chapel, a hall, and several smaller buildings, all arranged around a courtyard. The knights who lived here left little behind, only the usual debris of daily life, broken pottery, worn-out tools, the bones of animals they had eaten. The excavation produced no dramatic finds, no treasures, no inscriptions, only the ordinary evidence of ordinary lives. The site has been backfilled now, the foundations covered again with earth, the fields returned to pasture. The knights who lived here are as anonymous in death as they were in life, their names unrecorded, their deeds unremarked, their presence marked only by the stones that were uncovered and then covered again. In the village of Templecombe in Somerset, a painting of Christ was discovered in the 1950s, hidden beneath whitewash in a building that had once been part of a Templar preceptory. The painting dates to the 12th or 13th century, its style consistent with the period, its subject matter appropriate for a chapel or chapter house. The building had been used for centuries as a barn and storehouse, its walls covered with layers of whitewash and plaster, the painting completely hidden. When the whitewash was removed during renovations, the image emerged, a bearded Christ with staring eyes, his expression stern, his hands raised in blessing. The painting is now displayed in the local church, a fragment of Templar art that survived by being hidden, by being forgotten, by being covered over and ignored until chance brought it back to light. The knights who worshipped in its presence would recognize it, would know that it had been painted by someone who understood their faith, their devotion, their need for images that reminded them of what they fought for. The painting survives, and the building survives, and the village survives, each carrying the memory of the order in its own way. The chalice found at the commandery of San Bevignate in Perugia is a simple object, a silver cup with no decoration, its surface worn by use, its form practical rather than ornate. The chalice was used for Mass, held in the hands of priests who were also knights, passed from celebrant to celebrant over decades of worship. It was buried with care, wrapped in cloth and placed in a cavity beneath the altar, hidden when the Templars knew that their time was ending. The chalice was discovered during restoration work in the 20th century, still wrapped, still preserved, still bearing the marks of the hands that had last touched it. The men who hid it hoped to return, hoped to retrieve it, hoped to continue the worship that had been interrupted. They never returned, and the chalice waited 7 centuries in the dark, its purpose unchanged, its presence unsuspected, until the restorers lifted the stone and found what had been left behind. The reliquary from the temple in Paris, described in the inventory as containing a piece of the true cross, was among the most precious objects owned by the order. The reliquary was gold, set with gems, its shape that of a cross within a cross, its interior holding a fragment of wood said to be from the cross on which Christ died. The inventory lists it in detail, describing the gems, the inscriptions, the chains by which it was suspended above the altar. The reliquary disappeared after the arrests, its gold melted, its gems sold, its fragment of wood lost or destroyed or preserved somewhere unknown. The true cross had been divided many times, its fragments scattered across Christendom, and the Templars' piece was only one among many. But the reliquary that held it was unique, crafted for the order, used in their ceremonies, seen by knights who knelt before it and prayed for salvation. It is gone now, its gold in other objects, its gems in other settings, its wood in dust or in some other reliquary whose provenance has been forgotten. The sword found in the Thames in the 19th century, now in the British Museum, is a simple weapon, its blade rusted, its hilt missing, its origin uncertain. It may have belonged to a Templar, dropped during a crossing or thrown into the river as an offering or hidden to prevent capture. The sword is displayed in a case with other medieval weapons, its label offering the possibility of a Templar connection without certainty. Visitors pass it without stopping, their attention caught by more elaborate objects, more famous artifacts, more certain histories.